You're checking in with the doctor for your daily fantasy football update.
Oh, yeah.
The best thoughts, opinions, advice, and random fantasy talk in the biz.
You heard the man.
So here he is, your host of Doc's Office, Dr. Fantasy himself, Jordan Jaika. Jordan Jaika.
All right, what's going on, Fantasy Bays? You are checking in with Dr. Fantasy, Jordan Jaika here for the second episode of Doc's Office. If you didn't tune in the first time, my goal is to have a daily show here where I give a random piece of fantasy advice, a random fantasy thought, talk about a random player each and every morning. So, happy draft week, by the way. We are only a few days out now. It should be a fun draft. A little bit of chatter that the top 10 may all be offensive players, which would be the first time that's happened in NFL history. So it's an offensive league now, so not overly surprising, but we'll have to keep an eye on that. There are some teams in the top 10 with some defensive needs, so I'd be a little surprised if that happened. If you're a team in the teens with a defensive need and you see the top defensive player on the board in the late, at 9 or 10 range, I wouldn't be surprised if we saw a trade up. Or vice versa. You might see a team like the Patriots hop into the top 10 looking to find their franchise quarterback. But today we're going to be talking about Trevor Lawrence. I mean, there are very few things that are guaranteed in this draft. Everybody's kind of assuming that it's going to go Trevor Lawrence to the Jags at the number 1 spot and then Zach Wilson to the Jets at number 2. But after that, we have the 49ers at 3, so who knows what happens there. Seems like they're down to Trey Lance and Mac Jones, and don't you worry, we'll probably talk about that in the next few days here because that's an interesting, that's really where the draft gets interesting. That's where things could kind of flip on its head, especially if Mac Jones goes third. I think that could completely shake up the draft. Teams will probably be more aggressive in trading up for Justin Fields or Trey Lance, but today's focus is on Trevor Lawrence. If you don't already, please subscribe to the YouTube channel. Check us out wherever you listen to podcasts, Spotify, Apple, Google Podcasts, whatever floats your boat. I'm cool with it. Subscribe, listen. If you have any random pieces of trade information you're looking for, you want to submit a trade to me, you want me to talk about any sort of topic, submit it on our group in the Fantasy Hotspot, which is on Facebook. And make sure you follow me on Twitter at Dr. Fantasy Sports. So let's talk about Trevor Lawrence. I think this is interesting. I want to talk specifically about his fantasy value. I've kind of seen people all over the place on him so far. Everybody seems to think he's going to be successful, but there are some doubters out there. So let's talk about Trevor Lawrence a little bit. First, let's start off with his scouting report. This is one of the most complete quarterback prospects we've ever seen, arguably in my entire lifetime. People talk about Peyton Manning, Andrew Luck, and Trevor Lawrence is right there. This guy has very few weaknesses. He has everything you look for in a franchise quarterback. He's a great leader, decision maker, great awareness, great pocket presence, good arm strength, great accuracy, throws a nice deep ball. There's really not much he doesn't have. His number one negative is probably he's going to the Jaguars. That's not fantastic for him. I'm not sure if his flow can stand the NFL either. So we'll see if that has any impact on his game. But yeah, I mean, going to the Jaguars is not ideal for him. But one of the things that I want to talk about a little bit today, and as we move through and get closer to the season, you'll find out I'm very big into looking at coaching changes and specifically offensive scheme changes. So that's one thing I want to talk about today. A lot of people have been focusing on Urban Meyer going to the Jags. To me, I think Urban Meyer is brought in more as a guy to change the culture in Jacksonville because you have different kinds of coaches. You have guys that are innovators, offensive minds, X's and O's kind of guys, and then you have and not that Urban Meyer hasn't proven to be an innovator offensively. We've seen him bring in some interesting concepts into the college game, but I think he's been brought in to shift the culture in Jacksonville because we know they need that. So he's not going to be calling the plays, though, in 2021, and I don't think people are talking about that enough. So Daryl Bevel has been brought in, been around the NFL for quite a while, 14 years as an offensive mind. Looks like he's going to call the plays in tandem with Brian Schottenheimer, who is their passing game coordinator. So let's talk a little bit about Daryl Bevel and Brian Schottenheimer then, because I think it's it's kind of interesting to see where the Jacksonville offense is going to head in the upcoming season. So, Daryl Bevel was the offensive coordinator with Russell Wilson during his rookie season in Seattle, where he had 26 touchdowns and only 10 interceptions. Daryl Bevel is kind of known for having this West Coast scheme, which really relies on the run game and short, dinky passes, as most people would say. But we've seen Daryl Bevel's offensive scheme really evolve over the last few years. I think he does a good job at utilizing his players' strengths, which I think you have to be. I hate when coaches come in and say, I'm a West Coast guy, God dang it, and we're going to run a West Coast offense. But Daryl Bevel was like that earlier in his career, especially in Minnesota, but he did have Adrian Peterson, so maybe with good reason he stuck to that offensive philosophy. And he had Tavarius Jackson as his quarterback, which is not ideal. So, you know, Trevor Lawrence is a little bit of a different animal than Tavarius Jackson. Props to Trevor Lawrence there. But yeah, I mean, he's evolved a little bit, and I'll talk a little bit about his history. Brian Schottenheimer, I think, is an interesting choice as the passing game coordinator. And if you read some articles out there, people kind of view Daryl Bevel and Brian Schottenheimer as two complete opposites. But I believe over the last few years that their philosophies have kind of come closer together. So I think they're going to make a really nice tandem here. You have Urban Meyer at the top, who's been an innovator. He's going to create, or with the help of Brian Schottenheimer and Daryl Bevel, really create a innovative passing attack here that's going to, in my opinion, benefit Trevor Lawrence. I know some people are worried out there that he's going to the Jaguars. As I mentioned earlier, the Jaguars do not have a great history of drafting quarterbacks. Me personally, I'm not big into looking at things like that. I look forward, not behind. We're not playing in 2010. I don't care about Blake Bortles. I don't care about David Garrard. I don't care about Byron Leftwich. I'm looking at 2021. So there's a few things here. I mean, if you look at the Jaguars' entire history, they've only drafted a quarterback in the first round 3 times. Byron Leftwich at 7, Blaine Gabbert at 10, and Blake Bortles at 3. Now, if you're comparing Trevor Lawrence to Byron Leftwich, Blaine Gabbert, or Blake Bortles, just walk out. Just press pause, close the video, and don't watch any further. Don't listen any further if you're just listening, because Trevor Lawrence is he is a different animal. So I don't care that they haven't had great success. You need to look at the player. The coaching staff is different. I don't care about ownership. Even ownership has changed actually in Jacksonville, if you really want to break it down. So this is a whole new regime. So I don't care about any of that. And nobody was saying that Byron Leftwich, Blaine Gabbert, or Blake Bortles was as talented as Trevor Lawrence. Bortles and Gabbert, they came in with a lot of questions. They were very mercurial, we'll say, talents coming into the NFL. People were hot and cold. Some people thought they had a franchise ability. A lot of people thought they would bust. Nobody thinks Trevor Lawrence is going to be a bust, and rightfully so. So I'm kind of ruling that out. I don't really take that argument seriously. This is a new regime, a new coaching staff, and this is a different beast for them. They've never taken a quarterback this talented, so I don't care. Honestly, I don't care about Jacksonville's history of not being able to take quarterbacks because nobody's been Trevor Lawrence. But let's talk about Daryl Bevel a little more, his history. I want to talk specifically about where his offenses have ranked in the NFL. So his passing game, his passing attack has not ranked very highly in the NFL. On average, during his 14 years, he's had the average of the 20th most yards per season, passing yards specifically. We'll get into his run game efficiency. And his offenses, on average, have finished 23rd in the league in passing attempts. Now, that's not usually fantastic for fantasy value. You're looking for volume, especially for quarterbacks. So typically, his quarterbacks have not shown that kind of ability. However, one of the things that is really interesting is that they've been 14th in touchdown efficiency, which is a pretty big jump. Even looking, one of the things, actually, I want to throw this out there too, that I thought was interesting, and I believe his 5 years with Russell Wilson, they were 26th in pass attempts, but Russell Wilson was a top 10 quarterback. So that really shows you that this passing game is about efficiency. And when Daryl Bevel talks about his offensive scheme, it's about a power run game. props to James Robinson. Might be in for a nice season, and maybe not as nice as last year, but I think he could be a back-end RB1 still, which we'll talk about that later on this offseason, I am sure. But a power run game which sets up the deep play action, which could be fantastic for DJ Chark and Laviska Shenault, which once again, completely different topic. But Daryl Bevel is going to create, I don't think there's going to be a lot of pressure on Trevor Lawrence. You're going to see a heavy, heavy dose of James Robinson in that rushing attack, which will set up the play action for Trevor Lawrence. They've kind of hinted already they're going to use Trevor Lawrence's mobility, so you may see some random read options thrown in there. And I do expect Trevor Lawrence's mobility to factor in a little more than people are expecting. So this is a really interesting passing game. I don't think it's going to be high volume, which you normally look for fantasy purposes, but I do think it has a lot of potential to be a top 15 efficient passing offense in the league. So looking at his history, I think you can expect kind of a low volume, maybe somewhere in that 15 to 20 range, but more likely 15th in efficiency. So a little more efficient than they are ranking wise compared to their volume. Now, rushing wise, they've ranked 13th in rushing attempts, Daryl Bevel's teams, over his 14-year career. So once again, I think that bodes well for James Robinson. I think this is really optimal for Trevor Lawrence. There's not going to be a ton of pressure on him. I think that's the one thing you need to be really cognizant of with a young quarterback. And the one thing with Daryl Bevel is he has worked with several young quarterbacks. We saw him evolve and develop with Russell Wilson. And I mentioned Tavarius Jackson. I mean, Tavarius Jackson was never a high-end quarterback, but the Vikings had some offensive success, and Tavarius Jackson, as a young quarterback, was never put into a position where he was failing as a result of the system. He was failing more of a result of his talent. So I think with Trevor Lawrence, I like that. They're not asking him to come in and be the offensive savior. One of the things that I do think bode really well for Trevor Lawrence, and I said this with Gardner Minshew quite a bit last year, was that this defense is going to be horrendous again. I mean, I expect them to address that in the draft a little bit, but this is a young defense kind of void of talent at this point. So, with that being said, Trevor Lawrence will have an opportunity to pass the ball. The game script's going to be very negative, which is good for quarterbacks because they're going to be down and they're going to have to pass. So, with all that being said, one of the biggest concerns people have is that Jaguars offensive line. I'm definitely concerned with that. This isn't an offensive line, however, that's as terrible as people makes it out to be. Pro Football Focus had them ranked as the 22nd best offensive line last season. I mean, I'm not saying that's great, but that's barely bottom 10. So they're almost not in the bottom third of the league. And if they make a few moves in the draft, this could be an average offensive line. Now, I'm not saying that's ideal, but this isn't David Carr Texans bad. This isn't as bad as we've seen Daniel Jones with the Giants, what he's been exposed to over the last few years. This is an offensive line that could be average this season with a few moves in the draft, and I think that's at least promising. They'll have a young offensive line. They have good interior guards. I expect them to address the tackle positions more in the draft, potentially find a center long term that Trevor Lawrence can be paired with throughout the course of his career. He's got nice weapons with DJ Chark, Laviska Shenault, and Marvin Jones coming in. I'm a big fan of Marvin Jones. Big time red zone threat, which will help Trevor Lawrence in the red zone this season. The Jags do have 4 picks going back to them taking a tackle in the top 45. They have a second first-round pick from my Rammies at number 25. I think they should be a little aggressive in moving up from that spot to try to get a top tackle. If we see Rashawn Slater fall a little bit, I think they should be aggressive. Rashawn Slater, very versatile, can play guard and tackle, so I think that's a guy they should consider going up and grabbing. But I think there's a lot of positives for Trevor Lawrence. I think it's fantastic that in year one, he's not going to have a lot of pressure on him. I think their offensive line is going to be better than people expect. I like that they brought in offensive coordinators that have had a little bit of success working with the young quarterbacks and showing that they can use their strengths but not completely rely on their strengths to run an effective offense. So I think that's really critical. Is they're going to utilize Trevor Lawrence's strengths, but they're not going to solely rely on them to win games and to move the football. So I really like that. And you can kind of see they're setting up a deep passing attack. When you bring in guys like Marvin Jones, DJ Chark, and Laviska Shenault, these are guys that can get the football down the field. So I think they're setting it up to really run a power run game and then throw the deep ball, which Trevor Lawrence was very effective at doing at Clemson. So I think there's a lot of positives for him. Now, in terms of where I think he'll finish his rookie season, I kind of averaged out some of Daryl Bevel's quarterbacks throughout the course of his 14-year career. Would come out to about 472 attempts. If you look at the averages, that would bring Trevor Lawrence to about 3,700 yards. I had him at 3,707. I like putting a specific number on it just to see if I can nail it on the head. 27 touchdowns, which I know that seems extreme, but I think one of the things you have to factor in, Russell Wilson had 26 as a rookie, but that was with a really good defense in Seattle. In Jacksonville, they're going to have to pass the ball a little more being down with that terrible defense. So I gave Trevor Lawrence one more touchdown for good luck. I only said 13 interceptions. I think that's the one thing that Trevor Lawrence is going to be really effective at, even as a rookie. He's a great decision maker. I don't think he's going to force throws. So I would be shocked if he had more than 13, 14 interceptions as a rookie, which is fantastic for his first season. Gave him 316 rushing yards with that mobility and another 4 touchdowns there. So if you take those stats, that would have been QB number 11 last season. So not bad. I think he'll be a low-end QB1 or at worst a high-end QB2. And I know that may seem crazy, but even if you look at Jacksonville QBs the last few years, and Daryl Bevel QBs, with Russell Wilson was a top 10 guy several years. Actually, he was a top 10 guy every single year except his rookie season in Seattle. But even Gardner Minshew was 16th and 18th in points per game. Going back to Blake Bortles, 17th, 15th, 6th, and 24, his 5 years as a start. By the way, Blake Bortles started 5 years for the Jaguars. That's embarrassing. I don't know how that happened, but it did. But Blake Bortles had a little bit of success. Once again, I don't like looking that far back. But when you, I mean, people want to say, oh, he's on the Jaguars. They never had good fantasy QBs. They averaged 16th in points per game over the last 7 seasons. So that's a mid-range QB2. And Trevor Lawrence is better than Blake Bortles and Gardner Minshew. So I think that when you combine the bad defense, the new scheme, low pass attempts, high passing volume, utilizing Trevor Lawrence's strengths with those deep field weapons, an average offensive line, I think Trevor Lawrence is going to be more effective than people give him credit for in year one. I really think that he could end up finishing as a top 12 QB. At worst, I would say 15th, and I would say that's at absolute worst. Obviously, I'm projecting it out if he was playing a 16-game season, but even if you go points per game, I'd expect somewhere between 11th and 14th. And realistically, when you're taking him in fantasy drafts, he's going to be going in that 16 or so range. So I think you're really buying him, especially in redraft leagues, at his bottom level value. And I think that he's poised to outperform that ADP as we move closer to redraft season. So that's what I have in Trevor Lawrence. Drop a comment below. Let me know what you think of Trevor Lawrence, what his stats will look like in year one. As I said, please subscribe, share with your friends. Post questions. Let's talk a little bit. Go like the Fantasy Hotspot group. Go join it. Join your fellow sports nuts on Facebook. Appreciate the support, guys. Hoping to see you for the next episode. Peace out, Girl Scouts.